Welcome, everyone. I think we should go ahead and get started. I wanted to just note that we are recording this. This is a one of the second UCHRI Slavic related faculty seminar that I've been involved in. And part of our purpose is to just bring UC faculty together from different campuses in a little bit of a intimate but Zoom forum to have a conversation with a speaker. But we also are keeping these for posterity. So if you don't mind being part of the conversation that will go up on the UCHRI website, please keep your camera on, and we encourage you to do that. If you would rather not be here for posterity, you should go ahead and leave your camera off. But welcome to this symposium with Joshua Yaffa. I'll introduce everyone in just a moment. We've titled it Reporting from the Gray Zone, Stories of Moral Complication, Confusion, and Compromise. And I'll just take a moment to introduce Josh and his interlocutors, Professors Alexei Yurchak from Berkeley and AINSLEY Morse from UCSD. We got to host Josh at UC San Diego last week for an in-person conversation with students. He's originally from San Diego, and many of our students from UCSD are also from San Diego, so it was a particular pleasure for them to get to hear him speak about his trajectory as a journalist. This was for a Russian class, so they were thinking about ways they might be able to use their language. So Joshua Yaffa is a contributing writer for The New Yorker, who was based in Russia for a decade until 2022, when he was caught in eastern Ukraine on the day of the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and after that was not able to return to Russia. He's continued to report on Russia, however, even after leaving, and has also made frequent visits to Ukraine. He's done some really important reporting on Zelensky, the Russian prisoner swap, focusing on Ilya Yashin, his colleague Evan Gershkovich, among other things. Joshua Yaffa's book, Between Two Fires, came out in 2020, and this is a study of contemporary Russia under Putin. And Yaffa pays particular attention to the compromises that individuals have to make as Russian citizens. So he's going to be talking about this moral gray zone that he touches upon in the book a little bit today. His interlocutors will be Professor Alexei Yurchak from UC Berkeley, a professor of anthropology. Alexei has written extensively about power and discourse in post-Soviet Russia. His fantastic 2007 book, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, won the Vucinich Prize for ACES when it came out. He's continued to write on a variety of topics, from Lenin's body to the war in Ukraine. AINSLEY Morse is my new colleague in the literature department at UC San Diego. We are so thrilled to have her here. She's the author of Wordplay, Experimental Poetry and Soviet Children's Literature, which came out in 2021. She's also a prolific translator of poetry and prose from Russian, Bosnian, Serbo-Croatian, and Ukrainian. She's translated texts that range from Yuri Tinyanov's Theory to Dmitry Prigov and Maria Galina. So I'll limit my introduction to that, and I will turn over the floor to AINSLEY and then Alexei.
Thank you, Amelia. Thanks to everyone who came, and to Josh for being with us. Alexei and I came up with a couple of questions that we'll start with, and we figure that will probably turn into a conversation, and then we will leave some time at the end for questions from the audience members. So the question that I wanted to start with, I frame it in this way. So as a journalist, and in your book that Amelia mentioned, Between Two Fires, you have been interested in this idea of encountering the other, which is something I think we'll talk about a bit later as it relates to some teaching you've done. And this approach maybe kind of can have the effect of reinforcing cultural difference, but you are also engaged in the process of humanizing the Russians, pushing back against entrenched Cold War era Western stereotypes about good and bad Russians. And in the book, you focus on people, and in a lot of your journalistic work, people who find themselves in these moral gray zones and have to make compromises. But this is against the backdrop of a totalitarian system. And maybe there's an implication that these people might not end up in these zones if they didn't live in Russia. So the first question that comes out of this for me is, does this compromise model, which I love because I also love Davlatov, who you have told me is an inspiration for it, does it extend to other contexts? Does it extend to your own native context of the US or Germany, where you live now? What about it is site-specific?
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation to be here and the very good question, which I thought a lot about as I was writing the book, and certainly since it has come out. And the short answer is there's much more universal in the idea of compromise and this whole dynamic and paradigm than there is particular to Russia. Though I chose it as a lens for making sense of and telling the story of modern Russia because I think it's particularly applicable, or particularly rather it gives particular power of insight and explanation in making sense of modern Russia. It's not that this dynamic only exists there, of course not. Not only do I reject this kind of Cold War era, as you said, idea of good and bad and placing everything in one or the other moral extreme, I also don't believe in this idea of a Russian soul, or that there's something kind of unique either on the level of actual genetic DNA or even kind of atmospheric cultural DNA about Russia, the Russian people, Russian society, Russian people, like societies and people everywhere, respond to context, cultural, political, historical context. And so in that sense, contemporary Russia is very much formed by experiences that have come before. Soviet period, late Soviet period here. I, in the book, explicitly build off the work of Alexei, who I'm honored and very lucky to have here with us today. So none of this happens in a vacuum. In other words, how Russians learn or intuit, rather, I think it's more subconscious than conscious, adapt themselves to the rules of the game and to take their own ambitions, desires, priorities, and learn how to pursue them in a kind of symbiosis or modus vivendi with the state and with the system. Russians are, and here, of course, I'm speaking in impossible generalizations, but there is this tendency that I noticed and I wrote about of Russian people in all or many walks of life being savvy at navigating that game of kind of projecting a certain or necessary outward loyalty while harboring inner beliefs that may be much different than that, or perhaps no beliefs at all. But they're kind of know how to enact loyalty or enact play act belief when necessary. And the difference is, and this gets to the reason of why I chose compromise as a lens for making sense of Russia, is that the reach of the state in modern Russia, and I was writing about the advanced Putin period, but pre-war Putin period, 2010s into, well, the book came out in 2020, so really it captured the period from, let's say, 2010, 2020. The state was just present in so many aspects of life. There's a character in the book who's an Orthodox priest. There's another character in the book, Kirill Serebnikov, a theater director. And not to mention, there's Konstantin Ernst, the director of Channel One. There's other figures, a human rights activist in Chechnya. And in the lives of all of those people, what the state wanted, the state's kind of prerogative interjected itself, and they had to accommodate themselves to the rules that the state was enacting and propagating. And that's different. I think I'm not in a way say kind of it happens entirely in Russia and happens 0% elsewhere, including in the United States or Germany. No, but it's a matter of degree. In Russia, I don't have the figure in front of me, but and this figure has only increased, I'm sure, as a result of closure of some independent theater since the start of the war. But more than 70%, if I remember correctly, of dramatic theaters in Russia were state-run. And so that meant if you were a theater director like Kirill Serebnikov, the impetus to navigate relations with the state was just objective and unavoidable. If you wanted to pursue a career and you were someone of great talent and ambition like Serebnikov, who had a real creative vision, how do you realize that creative vision? Well, you can only do so in some sort of if not outright cooperation with the state, at least accommodation with the state and its interest. And there was this period in Serebrennikov's career when he became very close to Vladislav Surkov, the kind of, the time Grey Cardinal of the Kremlin. And I found that relationship very interesting. Same is true, maybe even more so in film, to take another creative industry where financing from the state is essentially, I mean, it's kind of the only game in town, at least to provide the kind of money to produce a film of substantial kind of scale and ambition. And so, as one film producer I remember told me back when I was reporting the book, like, it's not a question of, do you want to make a movie with state participation or not? The question is, do you want to make a movie? If you want to make a movie, then state participation is required. And because of that, then you have to navigate all of these decisions, compromises, big and small, about, what are you willing, where are you willing to bend? And the phenomenon I'm most interested in, what compromises do you make, at least you tell yourself, in the service of a greater ideal, a greater good? And that might be true, that might be not true, but in aggregate, what do those small compromises over time do to you as an individual and how you understand yourself as a citizen, but also, in aggregate, society writ large. And so that phenomenon, as I just described it, I think, just don't want to repeat myself too much here, but like has particular resonance in contemporary Russia for these kind of objective factors I've described. Of course, it exists in America too, and I write about this a bit in the book. There are different forces, my bosses at the New Yorker, people who yell at me on social media. I mean, there are these other forces one navigates and thinks, am I willing to cross the interests of this or that group? But none of these groups hold the singular power to, both deprive me of a livelihood, put me in jail, right? There's the state just has this monopoly of power in Russia. And since it's hard to escape in so many walks of life, and yet it also has this power over so many realms, economic, judicial, and so on, it does create a different dynamic that I think it's not exclusively particular to Russia, but I think is illustrative of the way Russian society works in the Putin era.
Thank you. I'm going to pass the mic to Alexei, but I have a brief follow-up. As a scholar, I work on unofficial literature and art of the late Soviet period. One of the main areas of my work is there. And part of what got me into it was coming out of like DIY art and music communities in the US. And this notion that Alexei articulates in the book that you mentioned, of vnie, of living outside of authoritative structures, basically, like, just resonated immediately and made me see a lot of parallels that probably were often too broad. But I do wonder about the way that in your book you focus on figures who are ambitious, on figures who are dependent on those powerful structures. And kind of inevitably run into, but I like what I mean, for me, it's illuminating to think about a very clear difference lying in the consequences, right? Like, you can crash your career, you can fail to succeed in other contexts, but you might not end up in jail. Yeah. Thank you. And Alexei.
Thank you, Ainsley. Thank you, Joshua, for being here and for inviting me, Amelia, and everyone. So I would like to continue. You can hear me well, right? Just checking. I'd like to continue on the question which Ainsley asked. So the book was written before the war. And since then, you've been reporting a lot, but the war has begun 2.5 years ago. And the figure of the state also changed. And you just articulated how important it is. It is much more, maybe the reach of the state increased, or it became different. A lot of the activities have become very much criminalized, as you know. The surveillance has increased, and in some cases maybe decreased. It's not only more, it's just different. And so my question, the first part of the question, I have kind of a two-prong, I'm sorry about that. Part of the question is, those middle people who are relatively powerful, the journalist, the priest, the theater director, Ernst, the leader of the TV channel, or other people like that, have their practice of compromise changed? Has it become more compromise? Has it become different type of compromise? Have some of them decided it's no longer possible and completely transformed their lives? So that's one question about the book Between Two Fires in the current conditions of the war. And the second half, which follows from that, in your reports in the New Yorker, you very well show how the attitudes and feelings of common Russians towards the war have evolved in the last 2.5 years. The initial reaction to the war was shock. No one expected the full-scale invasion. And in my research, I also discovered that it was complete shock and helplessness as well, connected to this feeling that there's complete inability to affect the change, right? Because of this extreme authoritarian control. But since the war had been going on for 2.5 years now, there's a bit of an evolution of that attitude. And people now many people at least now, according to the PS Lab research, which you cite in many of your works, have now been trying to maybe, if not justify, but explain the war. The figure of the inevitable has arisen. So can you talk about that a little bit as well? And that is connected to the first part of the question about compromise.
Sure. So on the first question, I would argue, and here we can all just kind of hypothesize together, that this dynamic of compromise has intensified. It hasn't fundamentally changed, but rather the stakes have been raised on all sides, and this middle path has shrunk. As a result, this idea that you can make some accommodation with the state, but not necessarily have your own personal morality kind of infringed upon. You can make small compromises in the service of a greater good. Someone like Ernst, for example, who I think already at the time when I was reporting and writing the book, let's say, was a controversial figure to include, in the sense I would be open to an interpretation even back in the mid-2010s that there was really no compromise at all. Rather, Ernst was engaged in a kind of cynical trade in which he actively participated in propaganda in exchange for power, riches, and the ability to every now and then indulge a kind of creative pursuit, which actually really does describe Ernst's position for the first 20 or so years of Putinism. But still, I found something interesting in him because he retained this eye of an auteur. He had a haute sensibility for art. As I remember this quote very well, that's in the book because I think it describes him very clearly. A friend said, he's an aesthete, but not a liberal. And oftentimes in the West, we think of, or we just tend to encounter people where those traits are combined. Someone with a kind of refined aesthetic sensibility often tends, not exclusively, but we often tends to have kind of liberal political values. And in Ernst, those two things were separated. And that's what made him interesting to me at the time. Now, Ernst is yet again, or continues to be, a telling or illustrative example for me because I don't see him as still engaged in an act of compromise. If he was for a long time sitting on two chairs, as the Russian expression goes, one chair was removed and he, I don't know, happily or not, that's hard for me to say. I can't get into his kind of inner psychic world, but has remained on one chair. And that is the chair of a kind of full-throated wartime propagandist. And there's little left of this aesthete who would, put strange art house films on Channel 1 in prime time and, buy the rights to Fargo and put it on, reaching hundreds of millions of Russian viewers in a way that I think at first many might have found kind of confusing, or, documentaries on Hunter S. Thompson. There are no more documentaries about Hunter S. Thompson on Channel 1 these days. It is a full-throated, as I said, wartime propaganda resource. And so Ernst, whether he made his choice or had it made for him, I don't know. But in a kind of moment when push comes to shove, as it were, Ernst chose to stay in his position, chose the position of power, authority, access, and whether out of belief or calculation, and here we'll never know the exact cocktail, and maybe it doesn't matter. Nonetheless, cast his lot in with the party of war, and in so doing, it removes even the last vestiges, as I see it, of this compromise that once existed. Whereas someone on the opposite side, like Kirill Serebnikov, now spends most of his time, or a lot of his time, it seems like, in Berlin, where I live, left Russia, I believe, in the first days of the war. The situation was a bit complicated with him. I just don't remember the chronology, but he was under house arrest for some time, released from this house arrest, and used this window to leave the country. But I believe that was already in the early days of the war. And clearly for someone like him, continuing to make art inside Russia would be intolerable. If he was able to tolerate the kind of petty compromises required of him, sometimes maybe not petty, but associating with someone like Surkov, it seems for Serebnikov these days would be absolutely an impossible thing to imagine. And again, in his case, just like in Ernst, different context, but this middle ground shrunk to almost zero. There really was no more space left for compromise. Would he become someone like Konstantin Bogomolov, another prominent theater director in Moscow? Many people on this call may know him, who not in one day, but rather gradually, but now has kind of fully ended up as a pro-regime propagandist, someone who still has a decent, let's say, although critics could disagree, aesthetic sensibility. He has a certain professionalism, but uses that professionalism in the service of propagating ideas, messages, and so on, convenient to the regime. So he's someone who made a choice in the other direction. And I guess what I mean to say, and whether we're talking about Ernst, Serebnikov, Bogomolov, the war introduced a time when it was necessary to make a choice, and it was possible for 20 years to not make a choice. Though I'm also open to the argument that this was naive all the while, right? There are many critics, certainly lots of critics of people like Ernst, and others, even Serebnikov, that they were naive to think that they could occupy this middle ground, that it stopped existing some time ago and they were just fooling themselves. I'm open to that. But in a more sharp, final, inarguable way, this middle space disappeared with the advent of the invasion, and the choices became much more stark. Essentially, lend yourself, your services entirely to the project of the war and the kind of new political system, or updated political system that has risen alongside it, or fully exit the system. And oftentimes that means a kind of full exit, literally, from the country, because it's very difficult, if not impossible, to remain inside Russia, and certainly to voice any sort of criticism of the war, the political trajectory of the country. So the choice has become much more stark. As to your second question about the attitudes of everyday Russians, something I'm deeply interested in, I tried to follow and track. I'm glad you mentioned the work of Public Sociology Laboratory, a really invaluable group that does in-person surveys. They continue to have researchers on the ground in Russia who do field research, sociological surveys, focus groups, interviews in various cities across the country, and produce really illuminating research as a result. And in one of my articles for The New Yorker, on the occasion, I believe, of the last election, Putin's, let's say, kind of coronation more than re-election for yet another term. I've actually even lost count, 5th, 6th. I quoted some of their research, and they tracked how people, let's say, educated professionals in medium and big cities, so kind of people with whom perhaps Western readers in other contexts might feel a certain affinity, or at least recognition, traveled this path, as you put it, Alexei, from first shock, bewilderment, and that could induce various feelings. Some people disengaged from the topic because it was so uncomfortable. Other people actually felt a certain internal opposition. They didn't like the war. They weren't comfortable with it. They thought it was scary, a bad idea. But over the course of 2.5 years, many of them, not exclusively, right, but we see this in the interviews that Public Sociology Laboratory does, reached their own kind of accommodation with the reality of war, And the arguments, internal arguments, are varied. Some people see it essentially as an inevitability, or a kind of universality of human existence. There's always war somewhere. There was war here. There's war there. There's 5 other wars going on at any one time in the world. This is just another war. Like, we shouldn't feel so guilty. We nor the world should be so obsessed about this war in particular. War is a feature of human nature. Another segment, or at least can overlap, begins to absorb Russian state narratives about the origins and reasons of the war, that Russia is surrounded by those who wish it ill. The West is out to undermine and weaken Russia. And here, I think very well, it's again, a function of human nature, not of Russian nature. There's nothing particularly Russian about this dynamic, but the way that humans can confuse effect with cause. I think that's something we're all susceptible to. But after 2.5 years of war and the results of the invasion, sanctions against Russian economy, isolation of Russia, cutting off of travel ties, very difficult for ordinary Russians to travel to Europe, impossible for them to withdraw money from an ATM if they do make it to Europe. This brief moment when there's at least talk of, will the automobiles of Russians be confiscated at the EU border? Will their shampoo be confiscated? Right in the end, I think this is much ado about nothing, the question of the shampoo bottles, but it still created this general feeling among many Russians that we're not welcome in the West, and that indeed, maybe the West does in some way have it out for us or view us as kind of lesser second-class global citizens. And then you can kind of retrofit a narrative about the war, the invasion, and its causes, in which you become to blame the United States, the West, NATO, and so on, rather than blaming your own political leaders. That's a trajectory I certainly don't agree with, but I find entirely understandable how kind of human psyche and human nature can work that way. And I mentioned this in my talk at Berkeley, where you were in the audience, Alexei. But I think we, as in we, all of us who maintain ties and relationships with colleagues in Russia, even those who are resolutely anti-Putin, anti-war in their views, a lot of them, I would wager, we all have seen among our friends and colleagues, to varying degrees, travel a bit on this trajectory and come to really bristle and take umbrage at the way that they feel not welcome in the West. And it's difficult for them, as I've talked about, for all various reasons, logistically, financially, and other, to travel, to create new lives in the West. They might even, many, I personally know, Russians who tried to emigrate, but it was too difficult for various reasons, a lot relating to just kind of logistics, documents, bank accounts, and so on, and return to Russia with a chip on their shoulder. Again, I'm not kind of justifying this or saying that was the kind of correct response, but it's an understandable one. And I think, we can multiply that by millions to understand how, the longer this war goes on, and I don't know if there's another, policy. It's not my job, thankfully, to come up with policy. How should the West and Russia and EU, treat Russians? I don't sort of take that role on for myself. So maybe it's inevitable. Maybe there was a smarter policy. I don't know. But nonetheless, the result is that the longer this war goes on, the more Russians, due to their isolation, and due to the difficulty they face in navigating the world at large, I think some portion of them gravitate, if not to being, outright rabid militaristic pro-war supporters, at least this kind of middle category of people who accept the war as something between, an inevitability, a fact of life, and certainly don't feel the same way they might have 2 years ago, their own country's sort of guilt or blame for this invasion.
Thank you, Joshua. This is very detailed and good answer. And I observe a lot of these things as well myself. So maybe we should just, because it's already 1:30, move on to Ainsley's second question. And then
I will just tack on to the last thing you said, which resonates with what I hear from a lot of friends and colleagues. in Russia. But I think it really is very important to emphasize how these feelings that might, as you describe, sort of logically emerge from the experience of isolation, vilification, whatever, are, it seems very important that they are being weaponized and used so consistently by the government, right? And I think about my own experience when I first started to travel and live abroad when I was still a university student, and I went and spent a lot of time in the former Yugoslavia in the early 2000s, particularly in Serbia. And of course, everyone in Serbia hated America, like so much, because we had just bombed Belgrade just like the year before I got there. And it was interesting because there was, I mean, obviously everyone was perfectly nice to me. And thought it was very peculiar that I was trying to learn this language. And yet I wonder, and so it didn't occur to me ever for an instant to feel particularly self-conscious about being from the US. Obviously, it's not a perfect parallel, but the US was not concerned about its reputation having bombed Belgrade, right? So it gives me some pause. I wanted to kind of continue the line of questions about the contemporary situation, and to this question of moral gray zones and sort of gray zones versus the black and white. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the rift that is inevitably forming between the new Russian diaspora, the new Russian immigration, the way that people who have left are relating to people who have not left, the way that moralizing plays a significant role in that relationship, and the way that, and I'm speaking mostly from anecdotal evidence from people I know, this idea that we Russians who have left are the good Russians. We are building the beautiful Russia of the future. You know, in a way that has these painful parallels with the rhetoric of the white Russian immigration following the 1917 revolution, but that exists in uncomfortable simultaneity with what people are trying to do who, for various reasons, often of necessity, have stayed in Russia.
You know, interesting that I'll take a little bit of issue with that characterization just based on my own anecdotal experience. There's no right or wrong answer here, right? I think a lot depends on kind of which circles you're in and the people you're interacting with. But, you know, I would say to this group, and I've said to other groups, that I find a remarkable lack of kind of political imagination, energy spent on imagining political futures among the Russian emigre communities that I know, first and foremost in Berlin, where I live, but London, Barcelona, Paris, Yerevan, Tbilisi, right? Like it happens, but if anything, I note and am struck by the way that people are consumed with the questions of everyday life, and bring with them the same kind of, or similar at least, detachment from matters of political and civic concern that were so prevalent inside Russia for the first 20 years of Putinism, where, you know, by and large, except for this kind of small slice of people who were very actively engaged in the matter of politics, most people, you know, were happily disengaged and went about kind of building and pursuing their private lives, which in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, right, became a very, you know, kind of pleasant pursuit in which you could have a European quality of life and so on, in ways that, you know, you, Ainsley, Alexei, and perhaps others on this call know from experience, that continued into emigration, though actually in a more pressurized way, because it wasn't so easy to just simply transfer your nice Moscow or St. Petersburg quality of life to these new European capitals. You had to really work for it. Things were confusing. Documents were difficult. Money was tight. You had to get your kids in school. And those are the questions that I see the emigres that I'm exposed to most involved in. And I don't actually see a lot of energy being spent on imagining alternative political futures. I see a lot less of this kind of cafe politicking, in which people are thinking about, you know, what will the future post-Putin Russian constitution look like, right? Like I'm not saying it's not happening. It's just that's not what I see. I see, you know, I see people talking about which virtual bank is better to open an account in, how to get a registration paper in Barcelona or Berlin or elsewhere. And I see less judgment, therefore, perhaps as a kind of related point, I actually don't also see a lot of judgment on the part of emigres toward those who stay. I do see, though, transitioning to where I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you're right about everything, right? We just have sort of different, perhaps, anecdotal experiences about kind of the emigre daily life. But there absolutely is a gulf of understanding between those who have left and those who stayed. And that's actually a topic I would like to find a way to write about. I'm really interested in it, and I would love to write an essay on how these communities are really diverging over time, and that there's less, not even so much goodwill, it's just less shared experience. It's not that there's ill will, right? I don't pick up on a lot of sentiment of emigres talking about those who've stayed with judgment, moral or otherwise, but I do pick up on a lack of just this understanding. There was once a shared existence, and now there isn't, and that goes on for 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, and of course, at a certain point, the roads diverge a little, and then they start to diverge a lot. And this question of compromise, bring it back to the first set of questions, also is felt very differently in Russia than elsewhere. And of course, there are lots of compromises to be made adapting to a new life in immigration, but they're a very different type than the compromises of those who've stayed. And here I can speak both anecdotally and also referencing some reporting, but people who work, people who consider themselves independent creative professionals, culture, advertising, whatever. Of course, as the first and foremost, the economics have changed so dramatically, that there's, the state money is more and more dominant in the market. And if you're taking state money, then that comes with a whole set of political considerations, and that, navigating that is something. It's not that the emigres sort of judge that or look down on that. They just maybe, or not maybe, they don't have that same experience, right? So that's just one way in which to combine the first set of questions with the second, where this gap or gulf of shared experience and therefore understanding is becoming more and more acute, and driving a wedge between people, I would argue, not out of kind of ill will or suspicion, but simply because people are just engaged in such different, the kind of daily reality of life is so different. And last thing I'll kind of riff on, subtopic in that question, because it's near and dear to my heart, or to me and my experiences, is journalism and media, and Russian independent media. I have lots of friends, colleagues, people I know, respect, who worked and work as independent journalists in Russia and do really important work that I've learned a lot from. That's the secret of being a foreign correspondent, is look at what your local colleagues are doing, and in some cases kind of tread over the same material, but for a new audience. Any case, watching how this media has adapted, virtually entirely to relocation. I mean, it's impossible to run an independent media outlet from inside Russia these days. So those outlets that have remained now do so from outside the country. Dost, famous example in Amsterdam, for example, but there are many others. Meduza in Riga, a bit in Berlin. How are they able to stay relevant to audiences back inside Russia? This was actually something Alexei, I, and some others talked about in Berkeley a week or two ago. Is that possible? If so, how? Right? How can these journalists who make their homes, and these institutions that now have their homes in Europe, how can they at one hand stay kind of acceptable, like exist within the European kind of social, political, cultural fabric? Dosh ran into a lot of trouble, for example, in Riga, and was forced to move to Amsterdam, at the same time remaining relevant and having something to say to Russian audiences. I mean, can they do that at all, right? Is the experience, do Russian audiences look at those who live in emigration and think, almost by definition, they can't have something relevant or interesting for me to say? How is a Russian journalist outside the country going to tell me something about life in Russia. I'm here, I live it every day. What is this person in Riga or Berlin, even if they're doing investigations where they're actually getting access to materials that the person in Russia might not know about, just on a psychological level, right? Is there resistance to getting your news about your own country from someone who lives outside of it? I think that's also a really tricky, very much open question yet to be resolved.
Thank you.
Okay.
Alexei.
Yeah, so it's my turn, and I will actually jump off the topic of journalism, which you just mentioned, and media, and maybe shift a little bit to your own method as a journalist. And I will approach that because it's very interesting to me. The book was written in this style, and which I enjoyed very much, and also all of your pieces in the New Yorker and your interviews, which I watched. So I will start it with the course which you teach in Berlin. It's curious to me that it's not called journalism. It's called encounters with the other. And you talk with your students about needing to, having to live in the place and knowing people intimately, and knowing the language very well in order to sort of immerse yourself, right? You even call it immersive journalism. Which is a very particular style of reporting. I would say, as an anthropologist, that there is a certain resonance with the anthropological method. For example, this kind of ethnographic method of participant observation, when you have to be really part of the place and become really one, always reminding yourself not to go too native, but at the same time to go native, and it's very schizophrenic. But at the same time, to be an anthropologist in your case doesn't quite work because you need to produce work relatively fast reporting, whereas anthropological work is very slow and the kind of results take a lot of time. So can you talk about this method? I'm very curious, and I don't think I completely understand it, so I would be really interested in hearing more about it, and maybe give us some examples of what kind of stories would not be possible if you were reporting more traditionally, and how you explain it to your students and so forth.
I'm flattered that you call it a method, because that suggests a certain structure to it that I'm not sure is always present. I'll talk about first in the context of my own work, and then a bit about the class, which is related but different. I basically think that there's always value, or in fact, a kind of necessary point of entry is being there. It sounds banal, and I'll try and explain a bit in a way that makes it perhaps a little less banal, though this is very difficult, if not impossible, in the age of war and exile, but that the act of kind of sharing a moment, sharing experience with someone, having the time, patience, empathy, interest in another person in their life is really the kind of necessary condition for this kind of work. It's what gives you the right to ask questions. In the case of my book, to ask kind of difficult questions, uncomfortable questions, right? To kind of probe people on why do they make the moral compromises that they do. Are they uncomfortable with those compromises? How does that make them feel? How do they navigate this discomfort? I mean, these are awkward questions to ask someone. And, to have the right, quote unquote, to ask those questions, I think you have to demonstrate your commitment and genuine interest to them and to the subject. And that's done, first and foremost by the act of showing up. Really kind of, this also works in a totally different way in the context of Ukraine, for example. I would find it impossible to pick up the phone or try and call someone on Telegram or something who's living in a city near the front, to name some places I've been long before they became kind of destroyed or occupied. But Bakhmut, Pokrovsk, two cities that come to mind, cities I visited at earlier stages in the war. I would find it impossible to call someone on Telegram and say, tell me about how awful it is, right? Tell me what it's like with your house being bombed. Tell me what it's like that you've lived through personal tragedy. Tell me what it's like to, that your husband was killed. Tell me what it's like to see your home destroyed. But if you're there, right, if you've kind of gone through the trouble to get all the way there, and for that moment, of course, I have lots of privilege. I go leave that city and go sleep in a hotel. I'm safe. But for that moment, right, I'm kind of living through the same experience that they are. And I think that gives me the right then to probe to ask these questions that are difficult and in many ways traumatic. But I'm there. And I think that's very important. And also there with maybe now to do a bit of a U-turn back to the subject of the book, with open, genuine, it's not an act. I'm not faking curiosity or empathy. I'm not faking a pose of no judgment. It's real. Like, I know that lots of people, lots of readers may judge, for example, Ernst, someone we've now talked about a lot, and kind of decide that he's not a kind of mixed character, but he's actually on the side of evil, and it's an open and shut case. I'm open to that. But when I was with Ernst, I wasn't there to kind of catch him in a moral failing, or to cast judgment. I was really there to try and get as much inside his own inner world and kind of see the world from his perspective as I could. And when you do that genuinely, I think people respond to that, and kind of meet you in turn with a position of openness. As to the class encounters with the other, I'm glad that you noticed that it's not identified nor classified in the course book as a journalism class, because in that class specifically, I'm interested in inducing or helping students have the encounter. Journalism is just the tool. Journalism is just the way, kind of what gives you the right, the in to these other quote unquote communities and people, to get students in situations that are strange, unfamiliar, maybe even scary, but to help them see that actually with using these tools of curiosity, empathy, commitment, you can make an unfamiliar world more familiar, and you can see something, the universal humanity in it, and you can realize that these people entirely unlike you, or places entirely unlike those actually have more familiar in them than you might have thought, and that you actually have the right to speak about them. You can say something authoritative about a group or a person or a world that has nothing to do with your own background, identity, and so on. And so I wanted to create that feeling or that experience, and just given that I'm a journalist, the method or the instrument that felt most obvious to me for doing so was journalism. And I was interested in the journalistic product, and I helped guide the students through that. But if forced to create a hierarchy, I would say that I wanted them to have the experience, and journalism was the way to have the experience rather than the other way around.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask Amelia, who is running it. Do I have a minute for a follow-up question to this?
Of course. Yeah, go ahead.
Quickly. I'm very curious, Josh, can you tell us about the kind of projects students would do in this course?
Yeah, sure. So some really remarkable work. For one of the first projects, one remarkable student spent an evening essentially shadowing a bouncer at a strip club in Berlin, and just wrote in a kind of very kind of deadpan documentary way about what it's like to kind of man the door, and both in terms of interactions with clients, interaction with the mainly or entirely female dancers who work at the club. And it was just a great piece actually of kind of small scale anthropology, I thought, about the life inside the strip club. For longer projects, one very remarkable report was about the world of, I guess you'd call them train jumpers, train hoppers. This kind of subculture. This is Europe-based. For this piece, the student was not just in Germany, but even went to Czech Republic, and wrote about this subculture of largely young people, but not only, but people who hop trains, and the whole kind of social world that exists around that culture of riding trains. Another student wrote about one of the last kind of post-wall, post-communist squats in Berlin. Kind of a squat in the middle of now totally kind of gentrified Berlin, but still lives and exists according to the values and ethos of 20 years ago, and how it continues to function in now an entirely different context. Yeah, so that's just a flavor of the pieces, but I was really impressed with the creativity and bravery of the students who responded to the idea and really sought out these experiences that were unfamiliar. For example, the piece about the strip club, or the bouncer of the strip club, was written by a very kind of unassuming, otherwise in some ways kind of shy young woman who, spending an evening at a strip club was not her, natural, how she would normally spend a Saturday night, right? But I was really impressed at the way she purposely, consciously, she understood this idea and kind of put herself in a maximally unfamiliar, uncomfortable situation and emerged with a really it's kind of sublime mini, case study of this social world that most of us know little about.
Yes, it's very ethnographic indeed. Okay.
Yeah, we have a little bit of time for questions. I have a question that I'd love to ask, but I want to open it up to others in the room as well. If people are still kind of gathering their thoughts, maybe I'll just go ahead and ask it and get people sort of thinking. I've been thinking, I mean, this is something that I think I've been thinking my entire academic career, if I can call undergrad the beginning of that, which is the striking similarity between Americans and Russians who think about the Cold War as a kind of, point of greatness. And I'm not necessarily including myself in that, but I do see a lot of similarities between Russians that I know and Americans that I know in their approach to the world. And I'm also thinking about, some of the interesting scholarship that's been done recently by people like Tim Snyder and there's this wonderful book, The Light That Failed by Stephen Holmes and Ivan Kravtsev, why the West is losing the fight for democracy. And I think the approach is to see all of this really systemically. So I'm kind of wondering whether what you identify as this moral gray zone is whether the moral of the story shouldn't be how better to understand Russians, but how to understand Americans and where everybody kind of is what you're observing about Putin's Russia something that we should be taking an example from and pointing our anthropological gaze at ourselves. I'm sorry, I'm losing my camera, but you can still hear me.
Short answer, yes. And in fact, when my book came out, we were 2 years, 4 years, coming toward the end of the first Trump's presidency. And I saw a lot of similarities, kind of almost too obvious, uninteresting to name. I mean, important to name, but kind of so glaringly obvious as they didn't require a sophisticated eye to notice about, for example, how first and foremost, many figures, politicians, but not only inside the Republican Party, pursued essentially a kind of doublethink that we know very much from the Soviet period that I described in an updated way in my book regarding Trump, private attitudes versus public behavior, essentially, right? And the gap between the two and the way that people navigate or explain to themselves the reason for that gap because they're pursuing some other, greater political or civic good, because it's better to remain inside the system and have some influence than to become a critic, exit the system, and then have no influence. There's all sorts of reasons, some of them valid, it's a spectrum, some of them maybe more kind of self-comforting about why you hold on to a position of privilege or power rather than give it up. That's scary. You don't want to do it for your own reasons. So you come up with a kind of an argument about the greater good, why you're sticking around, which you tell yourself. But I certainly saw a lot of similarities, and I, as the book was coming out, wrote an op-ed, wrote a kind of essay on exactly that subject about how I was seeing this dynamic play out in America. To refer back to my answer to one of Ainsley's early questions about the kind of exclusivity or not of this phenomenon, it's entirely non-exclusive. And any society has traces of it, any society is susceptible of it, but I do see, at least the way I'm thinking about it and writing about it, the kind of compromise dynamic that I'm interested in does flow out of or is connected to authoritarianism, right? It's about I'm interested in a particular kind of compromise with the state or with state power, and the more power the state has, the more this dynamic of compromise becomes inevitable or relevant. And so, to go back to this answer I had in the beginning about the percentage of theaters in Russia that are state-run, right? Like Broadway is not susceptible to the same kind of different maybe dynamics of compromise regarding investors, commercial pressures, maybe to survive in the current era, the type of production has to be changed because, you know, audiences want something else. Audience numbers are falling. New Yorkers don't go to Broadway, tourists go to Broadway, so that changes the kind of productions that have to be staged to be commercially viable. But that's a very different kind of compromise than the compromise that someone like Kirill Serebnikov, Konstantin Bogomolov, other theater directors working in Russia have to navigate. And I'm interested in this one when you're really kind of face to face with the state that has this kind of full spectrum power, this power to fund or not fund your project, and the power to also put you in jail, as happened with Serebnikov, if you end up on the kind of wrong side politically. Those dynamics can and do happen elsewhere, like in the United States. But, you know, for now, they're happening here, and we should be aware of this and maybe learn from this dynamic. But I don't want to create, there's no need to create a kind of false equivalency, right? We can say, yes, these dynamics are present here. We can pay attention, learn from them, keep an eye out, but it doesn't mean that the compromises required or made in Putin's Russia today are the same as the ones made in America today. You know, there can be differences, but those differences can still be informative and cross-pollinate our understanding.
I think Tanya has a question, so I'll turn the floor over to her.
Hi all, thank you so much. My name is Tanya Ivanova-Sullivan. I'm a faculty at the Slavic department at UCLA. And that was a great, very informative talk that actually answered a lot of my questions that I had about the topic. I'm not Russian myself, I'm Bulgarian, but my professional academic career is very tightly related to Russian. I taught the language for many years, and I'm also a linguist who works on Russian. So I had a question about the Russian diaspora, which Ainsley kind of like asked already, but I wanted to talk about the collective memory that you kind of touched upon in several of your answers very nicely. But I'm thinking more about collective memory as an artifact and also as a creation of that new post full-scale invasion situation. There is a book that was published by Cambridge a couple of years ago. It's called Reenacting the Enemy: Collective Memory Construction in Russian and US Media, which is kind of like cognitive, partly anthropological, using those approaches to collective memory. You did talk a lot about the way the state is trying to shape the narrative in Russia right now, but is there a more kind of like targeted approach to shape collectively in a more coherent way this new collective memory that in Russians on the side of the state authorities? And I'm thinking here about, you know, the lessons, the patriotic lessons introduced to the schools, you know, the school curriculum, which is very, you know, important to shape their children's minds. Then I'm thinking about the speeches that Putin has. Actually, me and my students, we analyze Putin and Zelensky speeches in regard to like different metaphors and things like that linguistically. So do you see those different approaches as more like unified on the part of the government, the part of the media in Russia, to try to make Russians kind of believe in more collective way, not just individually, into this whole, you know, new narrative? And how is that tied to the Russian diaspora in a way that is the Russian diaspora part of this too? Or they're kind of like staying away? I agree with you, they're more fragmented and individualized, but are they partaking in this, you know?
Yeah. So my overarching answer, which gets to one of your specific questions, is I think there's little coherent or strategic in the way the Putin government acts. There's much more kind of entrepreneurial ad hoc activity than perhaps we see from a distance. And there are all sorts of camps, factions, individuals that have their own interests and use a situation like the war and the new political reality it's created to pursue their own interests, oftentimes financial, but also related to political power, influence, and so on. And I think there's much less. There are very few decisions. This is I don't have kind of inside reporting on this. It's my analysis or informed kind of guess. But very few decisions in which, there's a Kremlin meeting and Putin says, okay, now we have a strategic overarching policy to do X. I just don't see that as being the way Russia works, and neither on the question of historical memory, either on a collective or individual basis. It is clear, given the narratives that Putin himself has propagated about the reasons and origins of this war and tying it very much to history, Putin's efforts going back many years to create a kind of cult of memory around Soviet victory in World War II, and to use that as an argument in a way to buttress or legitimate his own hold on power. Like the overarching, the kind of key messages are out there, and then individual actors pick up on them and are very savvy at using them, as I've said, to advance their own interests. No one, if you're a Kremlin official, either in presidential administration, education ministry, like, you're certainly not going to get in trouble by taking it upon yourself to, rewrite some section of the school curriculum or school textbooks, so as to kind of downplay, for example, the Gulag, to perhaps, downplay the role of the Western allies in World War II, not that there was in Russian textbooks already a lot of, let's say, kind of clear-eyed analysis of Ukrainian nationalism, before, during, and after the war, but that, to certainly rewrite that history so as to link it with this, so-called tradition of, I hope you can see my scare quotes, Ukrainian Nazism, and so on, that is linked to the excuses offered for this current war. So, you'll only gain favor and certainly not lose it by, taking it upon yourself to pursue those kind of ideological objectives. And maybe in aggregate, they do add up to a kind of strategy, but it's not one in which Putin or someone in the Kremlin gives orders to, all right, in all aspects of society, in schools with these, what is it, разговоры о важном, о главном, about kind of important conversations about important things, and in textbooks and on TV, right? It's actors, as I see it, individually understanding generally which way the wind is blowing, and looking to curry favor, take advantage, and so on. As for the role of the diaspora, I don't really see one. Aside from diaspora or writers who find themselves in the diaspora continuing to produce work, and it's important work. I think it was Ainsley, maybe before we actually began the open part of the Zoom, talking about the work of Elena Kostuchenko, someone I'm honored to call a friend and colleague, reporter previously at Nova Gazeta. And for example, her book on her kind of collection of her reportage, essays, reflections on her time reporting in Russia, came out in Russian, was not officially, could not be published officially inside Russia itself, but a case of kind of latter day tamizdat, essentially, in which Russian language bookstores across Europe were sold out continuously, like one printing after another of Yelena's book. And I'm sure that a lot of those books, yes, were staying in the households and apartments of emigres in Europe, but a lot of them were going back to Russia itself, where there is an appetite for her work. And, is that enough to counteract all of these other messages that you mentioned, you were referring to in your question? No, but it's something. The flame has not completely gone out.
Unless we have some comments, Angelica, has another question. Angelica, would you like to unmute yourself and ask this directly, or I can read it for you? So Angelica writes, Alexei already kind of asked this, but with people forced to compromise aspects of their lives with an increasingly disappearing middle ground, I wonder what are the real consequences when that dissonance becomes too much to bear, especially when that compromise is centered on intrinsic parts of one's person. I study LGBTQ Russians, and while many queer people have been able to leave, many people who do not have the ability to do, many people do not have the ability to do that. In what ways have you seen this aspect of compromise over the self, as opposed to compromise of actions, creating art, theater, etc., manifest? And this is probably going to be the final question before we think.
That's a very good question, and one that I'm afraid I have a somewhat unsatisfying answer to, though I like this distinction. I hadn't thought about it in this way. It's something actually I'll incorporate and think about, and can I express in my own work, this distinction between compromise of action and compromise of self. And I know less about compromise of self. It's just I've spent less time reporting there. On the one hand, let's say it's easier. I say that not lightly, because action is something outwardly manifest in the world, right? You either like produce the play, or you don't, or you produce the play with certain scenes, lines, and so on, or you agree to cut them. I mean, there's a more like objective quality to compromise of action, because you're either kind of doing the thing or not, or modifying it. It's not something that exists inside your own inner world, but something you manifest in the outer world. So in a way, an inner compromise you could classify as kind of easier to navigate, because it doesn't have this kind of outward, let's say, objective expression. Though on the other hand, of course, it's much more difficult, because one can have a cynical detachment toward compromise of action. We've talked now at length about the different arguments, narratives, explanations people have about why they're engaged in this or that compromise. And it can also be simply quite profitable for them to be engaged in that compromise. Compromise of self is trickier, and it's trickier to find the kind of profit or advantage for yourself. And so I imagine, and this is actually now a point where I realize I want to spend more time looking at this as a reporter, that it can and should be much more traumatic, painful, psychologically difficult to compromise with an essential part of yourself, your identity, your personhood. And even if it doesn't have this kind of outward expression, if you're not forced to kind of modify your action, your professional activity in the same way, you are first forced to kind of keep quiet or even reject a fundamental part of yourself. And I can only imagine that is extraordinarily both tragic and traumatic.
Angelica, we'll all look forward to your work on LGBTQ Russians and to engaging with this. It's a great question. I think we're at time, and I so appreciate, Josh, you're taking the time to speak with us, and Ainsley and Alexei for being in conversation with Josh, all of you for coming. This will be available at the UCHRI website, and we can also make it available at our home websites on campuses for people to view afterwards. So please join me in thanking the speakers.
Thank you for the great questions. Enjoyed the conversation a lot.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Amelia.